I'm going to go ahead and get us started in the interest of time. So welcome everyone to the BHI Network Policy Group meeting. I'm so excited to have you here today. I'm going to begin today with the land acknowledgement. So we do want to open this convening by recognizing that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of the tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And we cannot work to fulfill our mission and our vision of an anti-racist president if we don't first acknowledge and recognize the true history and the cost of colonization. However, acknowledgement is only a first step. We urge you to engage in accountable relationships and informed actions with those around you and outside of your circles. Today, we're going to be hearing a number of different speakers, but just to remind you, today is one of our almost last meetings. So November 8th will be another meeting in which we'll be doing some more items around what should be in the 2024 Homeownership Policy Framework. I hope that you'll be able to join us next week. If not, it will be recorded, but we're moving towards completing that framework so that we can then begin all of our advocacy work with our December 13th policy summit. So those invitations will be coming your way shortly. Please remember to sign up for the Policy Digest if you haven't done so, and sign others up as well. Very excited to see that list growing. We have about 200 people who subscribe to coming into this meeting, and we have about 400 people who are following the digest. So great to see that expand. And of course, there's a link there for the Homeownership Policy Framework that we all advocated for in 2023. That is a new link. It has kind of a little bit of the wins that we had so that we can understand some of the progress that we made last year and looking forward to 2024. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and introduce Senator Noel Frame, 36th Legislative District. Senator Frame is a champion of progressive revenue and sponsor of the wealth tax. And this group did champion that last year. We look forward to continuing that collaboration and that work for next year. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And then Senator Frame, feel free to take it away.
Thanks. And Bambi, if you don't mind making me a co-host, I have a couple of topics I want to share as part of this presentation. It makes it a little bit easier.
Sounds good.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. We've been trying to make this happen for some time, and I'm just really excited for the opportunity to present today. So I've got 10 minutes, and I'm going to, my kind of plan is to first kind of establish some shared understanding of what the Washington State wealth tax proposal is, talk through how the proposal could have a positive impact on Black homeownership, and then name where I see some opportunities for partnership, giving your coalition's sort of makeup and track record of success, and then jump into questions. So just first and foremost, and Bambi, I think it's your preference, but would you want me to just go through the full 10 minutes and then do questions, not stop, right? So people should hold their questions. Is that how you typically have done it?
We have, but it's up to you. You know, if you're someone who doesn't get sidetracked by interruption, you're welcome to do it. But if you'd like to, have us give you that time for presentation, we'd be happy to wait as well.
Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do, y'all, because tax policy is complicated, I'm going to pause. I'm going to kind of do a section, just kind of walk through, and then I'll pause and take questions after kind of each of these, like explaining the policy and a little bit of how it worked this last session. So go ahead and put your hands up, and I will promise to take some breaks. And Bambi, if you feel like I'm getting too far down, be like, Noel, come back, but I won't get off track. I'll be ready. Okay. So the bills that were introduced, just for everybody's visibility, these are the two links. I did Senate bill. I forget that I'm in the Senate. This is Senate Bill 5486. This is the House Companion 1473 from Representative Meelan Tai. So just at the very highest level, the Washington State wealth tax, simply put, this is a property tax. It is a tax on a class of assets that is just wholly exempted from the tax code today. And so I brought a couple of graphics just to explain this. So let me do, not start summary. No. Let me share my screen. So just really quickly, so this first graphic, how does Washington State tax property? So as you can see here, our current property tax, which is a tax on ownership, that is applied to homes, land, and other real estate. We also tax personal property of business, but we didn't put that on this chart for simplicity purposes. So we have the property tax when we own it, and when we sell it, we pay the REIT, the real estate excise tax. That same tax on ownership, that is the property tax, it does not apply to financial and other what are called intangible assets. You only pay tax on those assets when you sell them, and that's only because we just passed the capital gains tax. So I always like to explain that to people that we already tax real property, which is, we'll talk in a second about who does that. Tax ownership, we tax when you sell it, but when it comes to financial assets, we don't tax it when you own it, we only tax it when you sell it. And that's a recent development, okay? You all may have heard this kind of phrase or just concept that Washington State has the worst tax code in the nation. It is the most upside down, the most regressive. We ask those with the least to pay the most and those with the most to pay the least. And this issue I've just illustrated, it's contributing to that. And I want to show you another graphic that's just illustrates a little bit about who pays and who doesn't. So as you can see here, we all know that homeownership has been the main tool of wealth building for the middle class in this country for generations. And of course, we need to pause and acknowledge, and the whole reason we're here is that the ability to build wealth in this way has long been denied to Black Washingtonians and other members of communities of color through racial covenants and other state sanctioned discrimination and other types of discrimination. So, we'll talk about that more in a minute, but clearly wealth building in this country for the majority of the country has really only ever happened through home ownership. And for those of us who are lucky enough to own homes, we're already paying taxes on the ownership of that asset. That's the property tax. But what this is illustrating here is, of course, the wealthiest among us, people who are billionaires, ultramillionaires, they're not holding their wealth in homes or other real estate. They're holding that in financial assets. And that's what you see here. Billionaires are holding this in stock. The ownership of that is just not taxed at all. And so we are contributing to our tax code being upside down and regressive by taxing the ownership of assets of the middle class and not taxing the ownership of the assets of billionaires and ultramillionaires. So let me stop. I'm going to stop my screen share. That is a very basic introduction to kind of what the structure of the tax is. I want to see if there's any questions before I get into some of the details of the proposal. I don't see any hands, so far so good. Hopefully my illustrations are doing their job. Okay, so I'll kind of go into it. And again, folks, I can take questions all day long, so don't feel shy about asking questions, even if you think they're simple and basic. Most of my legislative colleagues don't understand tax policy as well as they need to. It's okay that you don't either. Please ask. I would appreciate it. So just really quickly, the proposal that we had out there, 5486, was what we introduced in 23. We actually introduced it in 21 as well. This proposal raises $3 billion of revenue each year. I'm going to repeat myself, 3 billion with a B each year. So over $6 billion per biennium this proposal generates. That is paid by approximately 700 taxpayers in the state of Washington. Those are taxpayers who have in excess of $250 million of assets. This is achieved through a flat 1% tax rate, which complies with the constitutional rate maximum and uniformity, and leverages the power of exemption to have that first $250 million of assets exempted from the tax. I'll note of those 700 taxpayers, we know approximately 100 of them are billionaires, which was a shocking number to me, as I think most of us are used to hearing 3, 4, maybe 7 billionaires that make the Forbes list that's public. When you actually get into the data that is not public, it's estimated to be about 100 billionaires in the state of Washington. The revenue generated from the most recent proposal was split evenly across 4 accounts: the Education Legacy Trust account, which is our K-12 higher ed and childcare and early learning account; the Housing Trust Fund, which is a big part of why you all were involved; a new disability care account for our neighbors with intellectual, developmental, and other disabilities; and a new taxpayer justice account, which was intended to be an offset to the revenue losses that would come by offering tax credits and other reductions to taxes for our working families and others currently disproportionately impacted by the tax code. I will note that how the money was dedicated was a factor of legal considerations and political considerations, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So that's the proposal on the table today. Spoiler alert, it could change. The rate could change, the exemption level could change, how the money is spent can change. That is all up for negotiation. It is the tax policy itself is pretty solid and has been vetted through the Department of Revenue, the Attorney General's office, and many, many others. So that's pretty solid at this point. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Bambi, I'm looking for hands, but let me know. All right. So when I think about, the question to me was like, how could this positively impact Black home ownership? And I think I want to just kind of take a big step back and just state really plainly that I'm also the vice chair of the Housing Committee in the Senate, and have spent a lot of time thinking about the broader context of our housing crisis here in Washington State. And nobody is talking honestly about the price tag associated with addressing our housing crisis here in Washington State. I think the Washington State wealth tax is really the only revenue proposal on the table that even comes close to raising the amount of revenue to meet the scale of the need in this key moment of crisis, and I would also say opportunity. You all know these facts, but we now know we need to build 1.1 million homes over the next 10 years. We commissioned a study out of House Bill 1220 a couple of years ago. Those numbers come back. They tell us half of those units need to be subsidized in order for them to be affordable for Washingtonians. And nobody is saying out loud the price tag associated with that, y'all. And it is billions of dollars a year. Nobody wants to say it because nobody wants to talk about what it's going to take to raise that kind of money. The Washington State wealth tax is literally the only proposal on the table that could do that. And I'll just say I was so lucky. In my other hat, I'm also a consultant in my non-legislative capacity since we are a part-time citizen legislature. I had the great privilege of being in the room for the Racial Disparities in Homeownership work group that was commissioned by the legislature and supported by Commerce. Many of you actually served on that committee. And I got to bear witness to the conversation and debate about what it actually takes to close those racial disparities. And it is a combination of systemic foundational policy solutions as well as targeted policy solutions. So it is both. You have to address supply and affordability writ large, and you have to have targeted strategies to address it, like the Covenant Homeownership Act that I was so excited to fight for and help pass this last session. I see in this the opportunity I see before us is the revenue generated from the Washington State wealth tax can generate the level of investment that actually is required to actually address those systemic issues. And then simply put, how you dedicate the revenue is determined by the coalition that's involved in its passage. That's politics. And so there's no reason we can't come together and say, we want to really specifically say some of this money is going specifically to home ownership and strategies that we know will seek to increase Black home ownership. That's the opportunity I see to address Black homeownership at a policy level, how this is connected. And I will say, I want to just speak a couple because I don't see any hands go up, and then I'm going to wrap with this. I see real opportunities for partnership with this coalition specifically. First, as I just stated, as a vice chair of the Housing Committee and a senator, I was witness to the incredible coalition work that you did this last session to come together and pass the Covenant Homeownership Act. That bill passing in its first session, that doesn't happen. Y'all know that. That was an amazing accomplishment. And I am well aware of the deep political and coalition work that went into that. I commend you. And I frankly think that you guys have the right stuff to actually make the Washington State wealth tax your next big win. I think you have it. The second thing I would say within your coalition is you really formed some pretty unlikely alliances. That was a sight to see. And I think it's part of what made you so successful. I think we are once again at a place where we need an unlikely coalition to come together to pass this legislation. This is visionary legislation that frankly is new. will take time to implement. And it's not quite a perfect match to our typical revenue approaches that have been near-term, tried and true revenue policies that generate money immediately or near immediately, that tie to very discrete spending in moments of crisis. This bill is visionary, takes time to set up, would set us out as a leader in the country, which is very similar to the visionary project you all have embarked upon to actually close the Black homeownership gap and tackle the racial wealth gap. And I frankly think there's an incredible through line to our two policies that make this work. I will say third, you are rooted in the world of philanthropy. BHI is hosted out of Civic Commons, the Seattle Foundation. There are many of you that are involved in the world of philanthropy. And folks, many of the leaders in our community who have led in the world of philanthropy and called out that they should never have had this much money in the first place and they're going to give it away, should lean into the conversation about changing the underlying systems that allowed them to build that wealth in the first place. I have heard some of our resident billionaires say exactly that. This is the opportunity to invite them in, to call them in, to welcome them in, to be a part of undoing such incredible systemic harm and start here in Washington State what could change, frankly, the country and the world if we get it right. Fourth, I will say, and I see Sarah on the line. I'm excited. We've just been engaged in conversation. You all also have partners in the business community. And I think the business community and leaders within the community need to stand up and echo what the research supports, that this and other tax policy supports rather than undermines economic competitiveness. It's going to make us more competitive if people can move to Washington State and think they have a fighting chance to own a home, which they can't do in a lot of places in this country, particularly in high cost of living cities like ours that have an otherwise incredible economy. But as Lieutenant Governor Heck said, our housing crisis is a major vulnerability to our economic stability in the long run. And this tax policy, we need people to stand up and shut down the tropes, all the same tropes that were used with the capital gains tax that clearly were false, and stand up and say, no, actually, this is good economic policy and we need to lead. Finally, I'll just say, I just think, as I said earlier, there's a through line here. I think there would be some sweet poetic justice to the idea of taxing what I would consider oppressive levels of wealth to turn around and create wealth building opportunities for others, particularly Black Washingtonians who have systematically, through state sanctioned discrimination and other discrimination, been denied the opportunity to own a home and build wealth for themselves and their descendants. The Covenant Homeownership Act was an incredible feat, an incredible first step. Let's go with the Washington State Wealth Tax to take that next big leap to achieving your goals. So with that, I will stop and see what questions y'all have. And I see there's hands up. Woo!
There are hands. And that was quite a presentation. I'm excited. We're riled up here. And this is what we need. So I have Cliff and then Kathleen.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I have chills. I'm fired up and ready to go. And I really appreciate like the strategic outlook too, thinking about the different alliances, different relationships we can leverage to get something like this over the hill. So I'm gonna ask like a really simplistic and dumb question. Actually, Peter kind of put a similar line of thought, but in like a bit more precise way in the chat. Just want to highlight that before I ask, but how is this different? Like, can you walk me through the legal logic of how this would be different than like an income tax? Because as you know, I've been privy both in my Habitat life and before that to all the progressive revenue conversations, and you know that it's a good idea. But I'm wondering, like, for like the layman, like you said, that really isn't well versed in this tax policy as you, how does this differ from an income tax, which we've been told time and time again, oh, that's illegal. We can't tax income.
Yep. Got it. Okay. So, and I see Peter's question. I'm happy to take that one too separately. So a couple of like key mechanics on income and then our constitutionality. So I think the key difference is it's not an income tax because we're talking about assets. And when I say income is sort of the incoming, your incoming revenue, assets are what's left afterwards, right? So like if you have nobody that's paying this tax is doing it from wages, they're doing it from the assets that they hold. And it's not even like cash. I'll tell you our estimates, but Department of Revenue's estimates were that 90%, 90% of the assets subject to this tax are publicly traded stock. It is very lopsided in terms of how people hold their wealth in the state of Washington. So we're talking about taxing overwhelmingly publicly traded stock. So I would just say from a tax policy nerd standpoint, I think if we actually ever went to the mat on income tax, I think income would actually be determined to be an excise tax. It's a transaction on the sale of your labor. I mean, we haven't gone that far, but your tax nerd resident here. So I would actually, in my mind, think of income tax as an excise tax on the transaction of sale of your labor versus this is a tax on the assets, what remains afterwards in terms of financial property. Okay, so that's sort of step one of answering your question. Cliff, I think what I have learned through all of this work is words matter, and there's a lot of nuance to what is and is not constitutional. And I think that we've been sold a bag of goods about what is and is not constitutional, first and foremost. Uniformity, the uniformity clause requires that we have uniform rates to similar classes of property. And in the Constitution says, and real estate is its own class of property, just for funsies. It also says in the Constitution that the legislature has broad authority to offer exemptions to the tax code. And boy, do we love to use that authority. As you all know, we have approximately 800 exemptions in the tax code. We use our tax exemption authority all the time. The way that this works, the way the wealth tax is set up is it is a flat rate. So technically the tax applies to everybody, but it has that exemption of $250 million. So in effect, it is only paid by those who have in excess of $250 million. I would argue that we could do the exact same thing on income if we wanted to under the current statute. I just don't think anybody's going to do it because it's not popular. And frankly, I did the math on how much you could generate on a millionaire's income tax using that sort of same structure, 1% rate, $1 million exemption. It raises for a fraction, like $100 million compared to billions of dollars. It's not worth it. It's not worth the fight. Hope that answers your question, Cliff. And then I'll take Ann's and I'll come back to the next couple questions in chat. Or not Ann, Kathleen. Sorry. Go ahead, Kathleen.
Thanks. I'm gonna lower my hand. Thanks, Noel, for your good work on this. Correct me if I'm wrong. There was a movement on this last session. Is that right?
Yep. So 5486 was introduced in the 23 session. I actually first introduced the bill in the 21 session. In the 21 session, the exemption was $1 billion. In the 23 session, we brought it to $250 million. I often say, I get asked the question, like, what is the right exemption level? I will tell you that the Department of Revenue has said 50 million, 50, is about the lowest we would want to go because of diminishing returns after that. The juice isn't worth the squeeze. There's too much work.
Yeah.
It won't produce that. It is a severe cutoff in terms of the revenue. So we're at $250 million today. We could go as low as 50 million and be in good tax policy standing. And then the rate is sort of dialable. 1% is the maximum in the Constitution.
Okay. What did we learn from prior attempts? Like, who's the opposition and what are their objections, and how can we, as a coalition, recalibrate and address those? And then I also just wanted to say, one of the people that wants to be taxed is in my circle, and she came to me really late in the game last year and said, "Can you help me write a letter? They've asked me to write something." And we did, but it was like way late in the session. And I'm happy to reach back out to her and at, at the right moment, like get her into the pool a little earlier this time. If you'll let me know what that is. But I'm just interested in strategy and how to take advantage of what we learned in the last couple go rounds.
Gotcha. what I would say is there's actually not a lot of real opposition, like in the traditional sense. Public polling shows that 2/3 of Washingtonians support this across partisan lines, which frankly matches national polling on similar efforts. It is extraordinarily populist, very populist. Our main opponents are inertia, a lack of understanding of tax policy, and basic political tropes. There's no organized opposition. I say inertia. This is a big change. It's hard. People don't understand it. It's a big bill. I think it's quite basic, but it's scary to people. And so just like, and it's like, we're not in a crisis. We've had so much money from the federal government the last few years that frankly, when I see my legislative colleagues get excited about raising revenue is when they feel like we're in a crisis. That's one. Two, people don't understand tax policy. The people that came to me and were like, well, I hear there's questions. And I'm like, what are your questions? And they're like, but I hear there's questions. I'm like, correct. What are your questions? People knew so little about the policy, they didn't know how to formulate questions about the policy. That's a problem. People are very scared to engage in taxes because they have their high level messaging about the tax code being upside down and regressive, and they get the tiniest pushback and they don't know how to argue. They can't throw a punch. It took us 10 years to get people ready to throw punches on capital gains. And I mean that from a political messaging standpoint. And third, like the only thing I've heard, like my dear Republican colleague who I love, Senator Wagner, who's put up with me for 4 years on the tax structure work group, just said on our interview on TVW with Austin Jenkins last week, he called it a jealousy tax, and that we're punishing wealth, and I'm like, quite the opposite. We're punishing work right now. We're punishing the middle class by taxing them and not taxing financial assets. So that's really it. There's really no real organized opposition. Tim Eyman showed up to testify against it. Some randos, the guy with like has the parrot on his shoulder that likes to show up and testify, like he testified against it, but that's about it. No organized opposition. Sarah, nice to see you again.
Good to see you too. I had a question about maybe it's about strategy, I'm not sure, but I've heard about some what is it, ballot initiatives that may go through to the legislature that may repeal cap gains or climate commitment and a couple other big revenue bills. So if anticipating that, how do you think that might change the conversation, or what is the opportunity that package kind of would present us with?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the concept that it might be an opportunity to be proactive and have messaging. I mean, I've looked at the initial policy and I don't think it has any actual, like, if they were to actually, there are referenda to the legislature, if they actually came to us, like, and they actually like, passed, I don't think there's any actual policy implications. I think it's much more, like you said, sort of a political and messaging. I mean, I personally think the wealth tax would be an enormously popular initiative and could be used to proactively combat a lot of that kind of stuff. I've been pretty focused on achieving it through legislative channels because it is the technical policy has been some real work to get right. But the bills are out there and they're things that could be publicly, taken and adopted. So like there's no reason not to do that. I think like I would be really open to more thoughtful small group strategic conversation. I don't want to give a lot of airtime to those initiatives because I actually don't think they're going to be successful. They tried to bring capital gains, to initiative last year, and were just did so poorly on signature collection they didn't even bother to show up for their appointment. The polls show that people understand it, and I will just say we now have a provision that says when you offer a referendum to repeal policy, you have to show what the implications are. So anytime the capital gains tax, had it gone on the ballot, it would have said, if this passes, it would, reduce funding for early learning and childcare. So any of these that get to the ballot, that is now statutorily required, which I think is like the nail in the coffin for anybody that wants to undo these good public policies that we do. So I'm happy to I would love to have a further conversation on that. I realized I didn't get back to Peter's question, and Bambi just cut me off on time. Peter asked the question, is the wealth tax assessed on assets every year or taxed on capital gains from assets as they are sold like capital gains? Great question. So the wealth tax and the capital gains tax are two separate policies. It was that graphic that I showed before. Let me actually just put it up real quick again. So I'm talking about the wealth tax is this quadrant over here, the 0%. So we tax the ownership of real estate and we tax the sale of real estate. That's the property tax and the REIT. Right now, we don't tax the ownership of the assets that are financial. We only tax it when you sell it, when it's capital gains. What I am proposing is that we treat and tax the ownership of financial assets the exact same way we treat and tax the ownership of real estate and other assets that are already taxed. So that's what I am proposing. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, it's perfect. Got it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anne was answering that. Are there other revenue conversations that you think may affect your, yeah. So, Adon, good question. So again, I'm going to be honest with y'all, like, I don't necessarily think, and we have to be thoughtful together about this, but like short sessions are hard for every policy, particularly tax policy that people do not understand. People understand the REIT a lot better than they understand the wealth tax, and I am supportive of the REIT. It is a tried and true method to raise revenue. It is being constructed in a progressive way, just like the bill I proposed in 2019 that we ultimately passed as a Senate bill. Like, that's great. We should do that. We should do that in 2024. If this coalition thinks we can pull off wealth tax in 2024, I will be in 1,000 conversations with you between now and the end of the year to see how we can make that happen. I think what is more likely is deep coalition and education work that starts today. And that we use the 24 legislative session to bring my colleagues and frankly, our policy partners that typically ally with us on these issues, and some of those who don't. So they see the opportunity to build that coalition and use the structure of the legislative session to really do that work. If I'm being honest, like that's what I think is going to happen. I would love to be wrong. I would love to go for gold and pass this in the 24 session. And I'm here to have the conversation. Yeah. All right. I feel like I've answered all the questions. Bambi, anything else you want to talk about? This has been awesome. I'm so glad we did this.
Well, we were very excited to have you, and we love your realistic frame. We do understand it's a 60-day session, but we felt like last year when we were advocating, it all came out just a little too late, right? So we'd like to get on top of that framing and that messaging and really help you bring that higher up. So looking for people, we will be calling to you as we move forward, looking for those testifiers, looking for people to begin to change this dialogue. And I think the one thing that you brought out that is very cogent is, we have a huge crisis, things that need to happen, and we are afraid to talk about what that would take, and often spend so much energy to be able to just get small solutions to a very big problem. And the amount of revenue we're talking about here is serious change.
If I could just add one commentary on how we talk about this and how we think about it. I know in the homelessness context, the regional authority ran into big trouble by saying it's a $12 billion problem. And in fact, it may be a $12 million problem. It could be. But if we're just going to solve the $1 billion housing problem in general, which is a fair assessment, given the number of people that are going to move here in the next 20 or 30 years, it can't just be a state subsidized program. We do have to create billions of dollars off of this tax. I absolutely support what you're doing. But if we just leave it up to taxing structure as opposed to free markets to build more housing of all kinds, we're fighting against the grain. We got to do both. And so I would hope that the discussion would be about engaging the potential of the public investment, as well as the private investment. And so you just can't say it's $1 billion problem. We're going to solve it with a wealth tax.
Peter, I'm with you, and I think it's all of the above and both and I think those conversations are happening. I see folks on this call right now that presented, Angela, I'm looking right at you, that was at the Housing Committee yesterday saying the exact same thing. So it's got to be an all of the above, but to ignore the fact that we need more revenue and to pretend that increments of 100 million here and 100 million there are going to, and those are real numbers, and we should do all of that. But like, there's more to do. I will say, so yes, and Peter, it's all the above. And Bambi, the last thing I realized I should have said, the one thing I don't need right now are lawyers. I've got lawyers. I know the policy is sound. Economic Opportunity Institute is working with, they've got legal counsel. The Department of Revenue was given a proviso to do a deep dive on implementation. I talked to them a couple days ago. Department of Revenue is talking to the cantons or the state equivalents in Switzerland who have done this for 100 years to talk to them and other countries that are doing this to better understand how this would look on the ground for us. They're talking to other states that have different elements of tax policy that get at wealth that aren't exactly the same. So I got the legal deep policy pieces. It is the messaging, the coalition, the strategy where I really, really need partners. So I just forgot I should have said that up front. Thank you all. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will bid adieu and move forward here with Jason. Jason Gauthier, South Sound Housing Affordability Partners. Go ahead and take it away, Jason.
Awesome. Thanks, Bambi. I'll go ahead and share here. So thanks, Bambi, and thanks for moving me around today. I see Councilmember Kiara Daniels from the city of Tacoma on this call, and so I have to go meet her after this, so I appreciate you moving me up a little bit so her and I can meet today. As you said, Jason Gauthier, South Sound Housing Affordability Partners, last time that I'll say that full name today, SHAPE for short, and I have a brief presentation regarding a proposal to expand the flexibility of a local revenue source for affordable housing to better serve the financing needs of our affordable homeownership developers. So just briefly, SHAPE's an interlocal organization created in 2021. We serve 15 member governments in 3 primary lines of work with the goals of increasing affordable, attainable, and accessible housing production in Pierce County. We serve these members through our state and federal legislative advocacy, through program and policy work in support of local planning and housing departments, and then through capital investments made in our housing capital fund, which will be deployed for the first time in 2024. So our executive board adopted its 2024 state and federal legislative agendas at its October meeting. And one of our priorities is the reason why I'm here today. The expansion of funding opportunities to support affordable homeownership development for low-income households, specifically through increasing the income cap on 1406 funds. And I'll talk a little bit about 1406 funds for those that might not be familiar. There are 3 primary reasons for this being a priority for SHAPE in this coming legislative session. First, the organization has been, since its beginning as a meeting of a roundtable of mayors in Pierce County, we've been incredibly supportive of affordable homeownership development and funding. And second, as an organization, looks to invest its capital funds. Our primary funding cities are interested in ways to both support affordable housing development and do that in the context of House Bill 1110 and the middle housing typology, which in the affordable housing landscape is a typology most consistent with affordable homeownership production. And then third, we see future affordable homeownership projects in early feasibility stages across smaller Pierce County cities, and know that we'll need to create flexibility in our funding sources to ensure that adequate funding is available for these future projects. So briefly on 1406 funds, in 2019, the legislature passed House Bill 1406, creating a sales and use tax credit that local governments could choose to adopt and utilize for various affordable housing supports for households earning no more than 60% of the area median income. As my cities like us to point out, this is not a new tax, this is a state sales tax credit that they opted into. The 3 ways those dollars can be used: rehab and create new housing, fund operations and maintenance, and rental assistance, all for households earning less than 60% of the area median income. So we've been working with members of the Pierce County Legislative Delegation to discuss amending the underlying statute to allow these 1406 funds to be used to serve households up to 80% of area median income for affordable home ownership programs. In the BHI area of focus, so South Seattle, South King, and North Pierce County, there are 19 cities that collect the 1406 sales tax credits in both counties, for an approximate total of $12.5 million annually. So a few pieces of background on this topic, and it's important to have these pieces of knowledge in place. First, local funding to serve households up to 80% AMI is limited. For federal entitlement jurisdictions, they have home funds. For the cities of Seattle, Bellingham, and Vancouver, you have a property tax levy in place. And for jurisdictions with 1590 in place, or the 0.1% sales tax, some jurisdictions use an interpretation that up to 40% of these funds can be used to support households up to 80% of area median income. I believe there are only 2 jurisdictions that have implemented that tax that use that interpretation. Second, the majority of local funding is structured to serve households earning under 60% of the area median income, including 1406, 1590, again, depending on some interpretation, and then 2060 funds, which go back to the early 2000s, which this is a document recording fee surcharge that's limited to serving households up to 50% area median income. And then third, affordable home ownership programs are best structured to serve households earning 60 to 80% AMI. I pulled a few examples from our BHI focus area and organizations, I believe, that are all on the call today. Since 2018, 70% of Tacoma Habitat for Humanity's buyers earn 60 to 80% AMI. Since 2018, the average income level for a Homestead Community Land Trust buyer is 64% AMI. And since 2018, 46% of Habitat, Seattle King, and Kittitas County buyers earn between 60 to 80% of the area median income. It's also important to point out recent pieces of legislation that are in alignment with this basic proposal. In 2021, the legislature passed Senate Bill 6212, which increased the income limit for affordable home ownership projects funded by a property tax levy. This boosted that for home ownership projects from 50% AMI to 80% AMI. It also left the cap for rental housing at 50% AMI. And then just last year, the Middle Housing Bill, House Bill 1110, created different income thresholds for the bonus affordable housing unit density in Tier 1 and Tier 2 of that legislation. The rental cap was set at 60% AMI, while the home ownership cap was set at 80% AMI. So how does this align with the Black Home Initiative? Well, through a few examples on the screen from those 3 local organizations. Since 2018, 37% of Homestead Community Land Trust buyers and 57% of Tacoma Habitat buyers identified as Black. And Seattle Habitat, historically, 1/3 of buyers have identified as Black. And so that brings me to the end of a real quick overview here. So Bambi, I saved you some time today. But I'm welcome thoughts, feedback, questions, comments. We're still working through this draft with members of the Pierce County Legislature and some folks on this call as well. We've already engaged to talk about this proposal, and happy to just take some early feedback and thoughts as we continue working on this. And I'll stop sharing. I see Cliff's hand is up.
Hey, Jason. Great work, first of all. Fantastic. Second of all, shout out to my counterpart in Tacoma, Pierce County Habitat. Keep up great work. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that interpretation of 1590, just so I can kind of wrap my head also around a little bit more comprehensively what your proposal to like lift the cap on those 1406 funds.
So obviously not necessarily the intention of my presentation today, but I'll give you the basic overview. I believe Spokane and Pierce County both interpret 1590 to allow up to 40%. So if you look at how that's structured, 60% is dedicated to certain special populations. And there's a 40% that sort of, I think there's not a throwaway line, but a piece that just alludes to and other housing services. But that 40% number isn't directly tied to an income limit. I think most jurisdictions interpret the full 1590 tax to be dedicated to 60% AMI households or less. But again, that's something for that's something for attorneys to decide, but there are 2 jurisdictions in the state that do use a broader interpretation of how those dollars can be used. I don't know if Spokane County has invested those dollars above the 60% AMI cap. Pierce County will be deploying 1590 funds for the first time in 2024. So there's no example of them putting those dollars in action in any way, and definitely no way to serve households above 60% AMI. But that is the interpretation that Pierce County is using.
Just a quick follow-up. Are there any legal challenges like that are in the wind, or is it just
you'd have to ask Spokane County about that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thank you.
And Kathleen?
Oh, thanks, Jason, for your advocacy on this. And I wanted to just point out that in looking at this particular opportunity, there are a whole bunch of cities across the state that are rural cities that have a different workaround for this. It's called 0.09 funds. And so they've already have latitude to use funds for home ownership up to 80% AMI. The cities that would benefit the most from this are the target cities for BHI. So South King County and North Pierce, cities in that footprint, plus I would say arguably Vancouver and Spokane. These are the places where there's a lack of coverage at the county level for funding, and almost nothing, as you pointed out, for homeownership at the municipal level. So this is like on the Venn diagram of areas and solutions that fit the footprint of BHI's goal area. This is like center field, is dead on, something that we should be doing and looking at to achieve our objectives. So
thanks, Kathleen. And I'll use one sort of easy example of sort of the limited nature of funding. I'll use Pierce County as the example because it's where I work out of. So the county itself in 2024 will have about $26 million of funds to invest, capital investment in affordable housing. Of those $26 million or so, about 1.5 of those are eligible to serve households above the 60% AMI income level. So that sort of that big playing field, that's the playing field that affordable homeownership providers really have to work in, at least here in Pierce County. I know in King County, there are some other funding sources that have been accessed. But in Pierce County, that's sort of the small slice playing field that our developers have. I did see a hand go up and go down, so.
Yeah, that was Laura. Laura, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I will ask it. Just you kind of touched on it just there, which is why I lowered my hand. But I was curious about how for the participating cities and jurisdictions, how does the money typically flow into the community? Is it going through commerce? Is it going through the agencies themselves directly? How does it typically flow, and who does it get to?
And so just looking at the BHI area focus agencies, I mean, it could be different, right? But I'll use, let's use some of the bigger jurisdictions. So Tacoma or Pierce, either Tacoma or Pierce County itself. annual affordable housing NOFA process, typically in June with awards in the September timeline for affordable housing. I do believe those jurisdictions, they do work with Commerce to try to align those investments. It's also the important piece of local funding and making more local funding available for affordable home ownership. Commerce rarely is going to be first money in the door, if ever. And I believe Ann Campbell can correct me if I'm wrong. So having those dollars that local jurisdictions can put in the pot to leverage future investments for the production of those affordable housing units is key in those early stages.
Well, thank you very much, and great job on the presentation.
It looks like you have one other question in the chat here, basically asking, where do you see pushback? Where do you think you're going to see resistance to this idea?
So the primary source of resistance, and I think, and Senator Frame mentioned sort of across the state over the next 20 years, 1.1 million housing units. Something like well over 50% of those will need to be affordable, so that under 80% AMI. But the vast majority of those units, as Commerce's methodology has made clear, need to be affordable at even deeper affordability levels. And so I think the pushback comes from more on sort of the shelter and rental housing side, where there's a demonstrated, at least Commerce's methodology, a much bigger need for units at that deeper, that lower, that extremely low income level. And so I think sometimes the worry becomes, you're taking money away from where there's more need. And so there's always going to be a little bit of that. We're not, any proposal would never dictate how those dollars have to be spent, simply providing more flexibility for jurisdictions that collect these dollars. I'm sure there are municipalities who collect these dollars that prioritize funding permanent supportive housing or shelter or sub 50% AMI housing, and that's their prerogative. But for us at SHAPE, as we begin to move into our capital round in 2024, again, my funding members are looking for some more flexibility to better align and also support more affordable homeownership developments as we look forward in the future, ensure we have the funds available. I think that's where the primary pieces of pushback comes. I'm sure there'll be some worry as well. I did a quick inventory across our jurisdictions, and I think of the 8 SHAPE members who have instituted the 1406 sales tax collection, I think 3 of them in their underlying ordinance collecting the tax would need to go back and change that to increase the AMI cap. So some adopted it simply by reference, some sort of called out, this is what that money is for. So to be able to use it up to the 80% cap, if they wanted to, we need to go back. That can be a headache, but I reached out to a number of my jurisdictions to ask if that would be a problem. And the easy response was no. It wouldn't be a problem if you gave us the flexibility. We could easily go back and change that underlying ordinance in our code. So those are the 2 pieces of pushback. And thanks, Kathleen. I see that note. Give them the choice. I know working with my colleague Carl Schrader over at AWC, options and incentives are always sort of the key that AWC pushes for, and this is simply providing another option for our funding partners.
Well, thank you so much for letting us know about this, Jason. And of course, as anything develops and what you're doing with your language or how you're moving forward, please send it our way. We're going to move forward now with Matt Zuvich and Richelle Geiger, Office of State Treasurer. We're going to hear about the Washington Future Fund. Everyone take a collective just breath. We've been hearing a lot. It's super dense stuff. We will have a recording so that you can go ahead and go back and review and rewind and have a little bit more of a summary. So just acknowledging this is a lot of information. We're getting it all at once here. Just let it go ahead and roll over you. You will have other opportunities for process. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt and Richelle.
Thank you, Bambi, and thank you all for being here today, or letting us be here today. My name is Matt Zuvich. I'm the Legislative and Policy Director for the Office of the State Treasurer. With me is Richelle Geiger, our Senior Policy Analyst, and we're here to kind of walk through the status of the Washington Future Fund. And before we do that, thank you so much for supporting it last year. Your support and the coalition that supports this policy are going to be the way that we get this bill done. So what I'd like to do is just kind of walk through, and if you could let Richelle share screen, we'll walk you through a slide deck that kind of tells you where we're at. Oh, you can go to the next one, please. So what we're going to go over today is exactly what the Washington Future Fund is, and kind of review for those who don't know how we got here. It's been in front of the legislature 2 different sessions. You did support it in 2023 in your legislative agenda, and kind of look at what the progress updates have been over this interim, and look at 2024 and beyond in terms of legislative efforts to get this policy passed. So with that, I'd like to hand off to my teammate, Richelle Geiger, to walk you through the policy. And also want to give a hat tip to my other teammate, Jesse Johnson, who joined us here, who I know that you've all talked to in the past about the Future Fund. So he just got back from extended paternity leave, and today's his first day back. So he's kind of drinking out of a fire hose these first couple of days too. So he wanted to pop in and say hello.
Well, thanks, Matt, and hello, everybody. Thanks for having us today. I apologize I'm not on camera. I'm having some tech issues, but I will be your voice leading you through the next few slides of the Future Fund. So Richelle Geiger, Senior Policy Advisor with the office. And I will review a bit of background and legislative history of the Future Fund, the work and findings of the 2022 Washington Future Fund Committee and Wealth Gap Study, and how it aligns with the goals of the Black Home Initiative. So the Future Fund is based on the baby bonds policy. This was first developed by economist and founding director of the Institute of Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School in New York, Dr. Derek Hamilton. The concept was first introduced at the federal level, sponsored by Senator Cory Booker in 2016. And the idea is that the state would invest $4,000 on behalf of every child born into poverty who's born in Washington state. And for the purposes of the bill, this is defined as children who access Medicaid health care before their first birthday, or Apple Care as it's called in our state. The funds would be invested by the State Investment Board. This is the same organization that manages state pensions until the children reach a young adulthood. And if the child exhibits financial need between the ages of 18 and 35, they may apply to the state for future funds to invest in Washington on one of 3 eligible uses: homeownership, entrepreneurship, or secondary education, which includes trade schools and apprenticeships. So when we were invited to speak today, we were asked to think about the question, why should the Future Fund continue to be on your legislative priority list going into this session? And as I was preparing for this presentation, I spent some time on your website to learn more about your organization. And I was struck in part by a few lines in particular that echo the findings of the Wealth Gap Study and align with the problem statement that both the Baby Bonds model and the Future Fund are designed to address. The families thrive when they have the opportunity to build assets and pass them down to future generations. But systematic barriers and institutionalized discrimination have excluded many Black families from accessing these opportunities. The racial wealth and housing gap is entrenched in our society and will require both immediate investments and institutional changes to meaningfully address. The Washington Future Fund is a tool to interrupt the cycle of poverty by bridging the opportunity gap that children born into low wealth families face when they reach young adulthood to invest in their futures through homeownership, entrepreneurship, or secondary education. And for the sake of time, I'm going to skim past a couple of slides and get right to how did this bill get to the point that it is now. So it was initially introduced in the state legislature in 2022. It was requested by our office as agency request legislation. It was sponsored by Senator Trudeau and Representative Stonier. And the policy bill was heard and passed out of policy committees in both the House and the Senate. Our office also requested a constitutional amendment that would have allowed the future funds to be invested in a broader investment portfolio, and that was sponsored by Representative Bowles. In 2022, the amendment was introduced but was not heard. And while the policy bill and constitutional amendment did not make it over the finish line that year, the legislature did provide funding to our office to form a committee to study racial wealth inequities in Washington and report recommendations on the Washington Future Fund administration to the legislature by the end of 2022. So over the interim, the office convened that committee and was comprised of elected officials, community members with lived experiences of poverty, and representatives from economic and power organizations. The group met 7 times over the course of the summer and fall with local and national experts to study wealth inequity, the baby bonds model, and address several fiscal and legal questions that came up about the Future Fund bill during the previous session. This group also oversaw the wealth inequities study, fulfilling the legislative directive to consult with experts to study and gather data on data inequities, specifically racial wealth gaps in Washington. And here were our esteemed committee members. These folks attended the 7 meetings. They engaged in thoughtful conversations with our expert presenters and one another, provided input on the final report, and directly influenced how the bill changed between 2022 and the bill that was introduced last year. As a brief summary, so the committee found that generational household wealth inequities exist in Washington and that communities of color are more likely to experience poverty than white households. Poverty is persistent, and without intervention, the cycle of generational wealth inequity will continue. Initial capital barriers prevent millions of Washingtonians from climbing out of poverty, and the Future Fund can be a bridge over that opportunity gap, giving children born into poverty a chance to invest in their futures. And in the end, the committee recommended 12 changes to the 2022 bill, and I'm proud to share that all 12 changes were incorporated in the 2023 legislation, making it all the more strong. So I will pass it back to Matt.
So thanks, Richelle. In 2023, the bill was reintroduced, and again, it passed out of the policy committees and made it to the fiscal committees. The changes that the committee recommended that we made are shown here. They raised the amount per child, $4,000 worth of investment. Funds are invested by the state investment board until an eligible claimant qualifies to make the claim, and they recommended that they defined an eligible claimant as a resident of Washington who exhibits financial need at the time of the claim and fulfills the educational requirement, which is basically taking some financial education there. A qualifying claim is the funds would be directed towards a designated institution on behalf of the claimant for use in the 3 possible areas. The funds would not actually ever get into the hands of the person that was going to receive the benefits from them. They would go to the institution like a college or a bank or that would invest in the business or the home for them. And again, to remind you, the funds can be used to purchase a primary residence, to open or purchase a small business in Washington State, and for costs associated with education, training, and professional development for the claimant. That does include apprenticeship and trade schools. And there we go. So that leaves us with where we're at now. Over the 2023 interim, the coalition supporting this effort has grown a significant amount. And quite frankly, the way that we get a heavy lift bill like this across the legislature is for people to tell decision makers that this is a policy that we want to invest money in Washington State. And through good work from economic Opportunity Institute and Budget and Policy Center, they've kind of been taking on organizing the group of supporters that is getting pretty sizable. And we hope to make it grow more in this interim, in this session. In terms of the 2024 legislative session, you know, I think it's fair to say, you know, Senator Frame said it pretty well. You have to set some expectations around the fact that this is a supplemental budget year. The need for the legislature to go back and adjust the biennial budget due to, you know, various assumptions not working out quite the way they did, or other things that came up since the biennial budget was made, is the big job of a supplemental budget year. That doesn't mean that we're going to not stop working on the future fund as a policy. Stakeholders are going to continue to work with legislators to keep that conversation going, and looking forward to making a strategy for the 25-27 biennial budget, and, you know, continuing to try to do things that will move the needle in 2024. What does moving the needle mean? You know, that means getting a strong coalition that is ready and prepared to engage with the legislature and effectively let the legislature know that they support this policy and we need to bring it into reality in Washington. And, you know, that's not always that easy to do and coordinate, but this group here seems to be pretty darn sophisticated at it. So we look forward to hopefully you supporting our effort with the future fund, and moving it forward in 2024 and 2025 too. It will be a bill that's resubmitted, and it will be resubmitted to the Appropriations and the Ways and Means Committee. That's where they left off. That means that, you know, we need to ask for a hearing in those fiscal committees, and then talk about what happens if, you know, they decide, the leadership in those committees decide that maybe they're hesitant to give it a hearing this year. And there are some things to talk about there that we can talk about at a different time. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Michelle. Wanted to provide you with some additional resources if you wanted to take a look at the report that the Future Fund Committee gave the legislature. There's also one-pagers in the committee report executive summary that you could refer to get some talking points about the bill. I think Richelle also put in a TED Talk by Dr. Derek Hamilton, which is pretty inspiring to listen to. Is there one more slide, Richelle, or is that the last one?
That's it. And I'd be happy to respond to Peter's question in the chat about what the returns we would expect to be. So these were the estimates the last year. We work with the State Investment Board about the returns that they would expect based on the time frame and the amount invested. So if that constitutional amendment were to pass, about $25,000 by the time somebody was 25. And without the constitutional amendment, if the funds were only to be invested in more conservative, fiscally speaking, portfolios of bonds, it would be closer to $11,000.
You know, in talking to the legislature and decision makers, it's kind of hard to find anybody that is not supportive of the policy and the need to you know, fight generational poverty and give tools to future kids on ways to build generational wealth. People generally get that. Where we get the pushback is the hesitancy to spend, you know, the $3.2 billion per biennium on a policy that won't start kicking in for 18 to 25 years. And I push back on that by saying, you know, I think Senator Frame said it too. It's not an and or, it's an and both. We have to do short-term funding for things like housing, for things like guaranteed income in order for people to survive poverty. But, you know, the treasurer looks at a long-term in just about everything he does. And if we don't make long-term investments to fight this problem, it's just going to be reoccurring. And that's just what the Washington Future Fund attempts to do. It's not a silver bullet, but it will decrease or increase opportunity for kids and grandkids to build that generational wealth in proven ways that you know, they can pass on to their kids. So I'd be glad to take any questions about the policy, where we're at, and that you might need to decide to help support this effort in 2024.
I'm not seeing any hands up right now, and it looks like you have an answer here already to the question around the return rate.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, I think we are going to thank Matt and Richelle for coming to speak with us today. And then just in the interest of time, so that we do have a little bit of space at the end of the meeting if anyone has some news that they would like to share, and to make sure that we give Kathleen some space for talking about their work as well. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much, Richelle.
Thank you all. We'll see you next time.
You bet. And Kathleen, so Homestead Community Land Trust, we're going to hear about the REIT exemption for affordable home ownership.
I just briefly, we're doing a little cleanup bill on the REIT exemption. A REIT exemption for homeowners of Habitat homes was passed a few years back. It just means that folks who buy a Habitat home don't pay the real estate excise tax at the transaction. We want that to extend to all affordable homeownership models. So we'll be doing some cleanup this year on that, and look forward to your support so that this can benefit all the programs that are serving the people we care about.
I love that Kathleen has these really concrete things that we need to do, and then we pass them, and then it's good, you know. So we had a bit of a fix last year as well, and they're important. So we'll definitely see this in our future and learn more as it continues to develop. It's kind of at its beginning stage, but more to come. Cliff, you had a question?
Sorry about that. Actually, no, I was answering your previous question about announcements. I put in chat, but I'll just bring attention to it. So this Monday is the day before Election Day, and ourselves, the HDC, we are in the whole constellation of organizations, like the MLK Labor Council, like I can go on, but a bunch of us are getting together at 5:30 on Monday at the Pacific Medical Tower in Beacon Hill. Particularly, I think it's a panorama room. Sorry, for our final push, our final stand before Election Day for the Seattle Housing Levy. So if you are in the area and want to help, it is 5:30. I put the link in the chat. You can RSVP there. We'll be making phone calls. We will be texting. There may or may not be games. I'm still working on a big prop for said games, but there will definitely be food. Yep, and there's phone banking tonight. Both Habitat and Interim CDA are phone banking. We're phone banking our office. I think they're doing theirs, and I actually have to jump on a call with them later on. So yeah, there's plenty of work to do for the next couple of days. So yeah, it'd be great to see folks come through.
No, and just a reminder to everyone on the 2023 framework, you know, the Seattle Housing Levy was definitely a part of our framework. We were very much advocating for this robust $970 million funding. And it is less than a week pretty much before the voters must return their ballots. So it is the moment to just let people know you're saying yes for the Seattle housing levy, and making sure that if you can contribute, that you do, even if that means just striking up a conversation with a neighbor or someone that you're seeing in another context. But the phone banking, the text banking, all of those opportunities have been provided, and it's really welcome. And thank you so much to everyone who has been involved.
By the way, really quick, so I see some folks are talking. You mentioned you can talk to your neighbors and whatnot. You can text them as well. I put the link in the chat to sign up to help, just in general. So it's like the general link. If you have 15 minutes to burn and you are able to, I would say you should probably use your laptop, just because it's a easier user interface on a laptop, but you can do it from your phone. And that we are working with the campaign to harness Spoke to text voters. I literally just made a text bank right before this meeting. So if you sign up and indicate that, I believe you can indicate that you'd like to text bank, we will hook you up. So please do reach out, and I'll put my email in the chat just for good measure.
All right, so Seattle levy, top of mind as we're moving into that final lap here. I will also just announce and remind everyone, I hope to see many of you tomorrow at Seattle University for the book talk with Leah and Richard Rothstein on their new book, Just Action, as well as the Covenant Homeownership Act celebration that will be a part of that. So 2 to 4 p.m. at Seattle University. I hope you already signed up for your tickets and your seats did land up filling. So I hope to see so many of you there. You were also very much instrumental in the passage of that act. You are an example of exactly what Just Action is about, which is talking about what are those local movements, what are those on the ground movements that need to be happening to create the change that we all want to see. Is there anyone else in the room this afternoon who might have an announcement, news to share with this group? Don't be shy. It's always looking for an opportunity to celebrate, any of the achievements that are happening within your particular area. Share a thought. Feel free to take a few minutes. And I'll just remind us, we are, again, closing out this process of figuring out what should be on the Homeownership Policy Framework for 2024. I am going to be sending out to you either before we meet again on the 8th or right after, probably a survey to look for your prioritization as we start to see that the framework is coming together, and what we're going to be advocating for in 2024. Everybody has been talking about the state session and that it's going to be short, 60 days, but it doesn't mean that we can't get things done. It also doesn't mean that it's not essential for us to be getting movement going if we're thinking about items that are going to happen for the next budget session in 25 to 27. So plenty of work to still keep going. Looking very much forward to celebrating our achievements once we have had that opportunity to advocate and get ourselves organized around the framework. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to me. If you know of anyone who would like to be a part of these meetings who is not currently connected, absolutely everyone is welcome, and we want to make sure people are connected. So unless I have anyone else in the room here who might be wanting to share some news, I think it's a miracle that we're actually going to maybe get 10 minutes back of our lives. I thought for sure we were going to overrun here today. So super excited to be able to give that back to you. And again, We will have the recording for this so that if you missed it or if you wanted to review anything, it'll be coming your way. All right. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today.